Okay.
This is episode 5. If you've been following along, this is David.
And Ron.
And we're looking at episode 5, which I remember when I got off the plane, having read David and Bradley's rewrite of Carla Robinson, so a very early draft of this script before Ron had even done his rewrite, called Ron and said, this is the show. I just read the first episode that really kind of captures all the rhythms and all the chords we're trying to find with the show in one episode. And you wipe to months later. Ron had seen the rough cut, the director's cut, before I had, and I walked into his office on the Universal lot to watch it with him, and the first words out of his mouth were, best show we've ever done, best show we've ever done. So from soup to nuts, this thing, from the origin to the final execution, was something that, y'all may hate it, but from our standpoint, this is a pretty damn good one.
And the feeling was shared by studio and network, and I remember them calling and saying they got choked up and how powerful it was, and that it really was hitting on all cylinders, and all for the rest of the season and into this season. Frankly, we refer to this episode a lot in conversation about, it should be like You Can't Go Home Again. We should try to hit it all like we did in that episode.
It was unique in that for a couple of reasons. One, that it was the second of two parts, and so the fact that even though we just got through talking about how Act of Contrition, the episode leading into this, was the favorite of many people in different ways because of the power of its emotion, this episode seemed to capture the emotion, the sort of aircraft carrier reality of the environment, and a very kind of heartfelt action quotient, which is kind of hard to explain, but because of the nature of the story, they're all looking for Kara Thrace, and her oxygen is running out, and will they reach her in time? It just kind of hit the bullseye. And the other thing that made it unique is that it was directed by a guy who'd never directed an episode of television in his life.
That's right, Sergio.
Sergio Mimica Gazan, who had been Steven Spielberg's assistant director on every film from Schindler's List through Catch Me If You Can, and was the co-producer of The Terminal, directed an episode of Spielberg's sci-fi miniseries Taken, and that was it. We saw Taken, and we were looking for directors, and I thought it looked pretty good. Breck Eisner, who was the director originally attached to do the miniseries and is a good friend of ours, told us that Sergio was a sensational director on Taken. Breck had done a Taken, and so we kind of took the nosedive and gave him one, and here it turns out to be one of the best. And certainly you look at this sequence of Kara and the parachute, this is all done on about 100 yards of rock quarry in Vancouver. And
the whole planet. I mean, there's no planet. I mean, there's just this rock quarry that really isn't very big at all, and they totally sell this as a complete environment.
Every frame of this was storyboard. None of this was, we didn't wing any of this. This was all drawn ahead of time. The thing about Sergio that makes him unique among episodic directors is that he really does approach these things like a feature filmmaker approaches a film. He storyboards meticulously, he plans meticulously. There's very, very little experimentation once we get to the set. And in a way, another one of our feature film directors, Michael Reimer, who directed the miniseries and is sort of our in-house director, I guess you could say, is known by and large for his improvisation, for his experimentation. The fact that a lot of what we discover in his episodes are things that we discover on the day on the set. So it's a really interesting contrast in styles, a complete contrast in styles between, I guess you could say, two of our best directors of Battlestar Galactica.
And they both work. I mean, they give you different things. They allow you to bring different qualities to the series week in, week out. This whole episode is really wrapped around the idea of the lengths to which men and officers will go to retrieve one of their own. I mean, this is kind of one of those great classic ideas in the military. You leave no one behind. And there are all these great stories of the lengths to which shipmates and comrades of people that are shot down behind enemy lines or lost out at sea, how far they will go to retrieve that one pilot, to go back to find that one sailor who fell overboard, who, they'll move heaven and earth to do that. And this is the story about when they go too far, when Adama and Lee allow their personal feelings in the situation to outweigh everything else. And I think that that's a realistic thing. I think in this kind of situation, they're the last people alive. They really don't have anyone else to fall back on. Every life is even more precious than it is today. I can see that Adama and Lee get to this place where, no, we're not going to lose her too. We've lost so much. They've lost their world. They've lost all the rest of their families. Kara is out there somewhere, and we are going to find her.
It's really an interesting strain for the character of Adama in that Eddie's got to play this irrational person. He's been so grounded and connected and stoic in many respects in all the episodes leading up to this, and suddenly he's got to be kind of this loose cannon. And it was really remarkable seeing how the way he pulled that off was not to behave in an irrational way, because of course people who are behaving irrationally think they're behaving entirely rationally. And it's really interesting when you watch him. It's not so much that his interpretation of the character changes at all. It's just that he digs in even more. He digs in much harder. And it's everyone else's reaction to that around him that makes it work.
I like this episode too because this is an episode in a lot of ways about the limitations of the Galactica, the limitations of their technology, the limitations that they operate in every day. And it's sort of important in the science fiction universe like this to establish what they can't do as well as it is to what they can do. Because for all the audience knows, they have, if this was Star Trek, the Enterprise's magic sensors would essentially pinpoint Starbuck immediately and they would beam her up with a transporter. And so...
Really?
Oh, yeah. The technology in certain science fiction shows is so vast and so powerful that then you end up spending a lot of time within an episode justifying why they can't use it. Like if this episode happened in Star Trek and say, Commander Riker was trapped down on some planet, we'd have a page of dialogue that would describe the anaphasic energy that was surrounding the planet's atmosphere, which was keeping the Enterprise sensors from locating his exact position, and the transporters can't work because of the magnetic resonance in the solar system, and we have to use shuttlecraft, and the shuttlecraft are going to have... you would have to spend all this time...
explaining why they can't just hit the magic button.
Because you establish all this groovy technology that does everything for you.
Right.
And a lot of times it just robs you of drama. It just robs you of an ability to tell an interesting story. So what was great about this is that it just said, look, they can't find her. It's hard. They're going to have to go down there. They're going to have to send pilots down in aircraft and look physically with their eyes to try to locate her. And they're going to have fuel problems. They're going to get tired. They're going to have metal fatigue. And there's going to come a point where they're using a...
Yeah, it's got to be tricky for James because he's so good and he's so smart and he does so many different things well that you can literally write him to be a completely different character every week, and he would so nail it.
Oh, yeah.
That you, even as the writer or as the people making the show, it's easy to lose your way. The nice thing about limitations with most actors is that the minute you go outside the realm of what they can do, you go, oh, okay, don't do that again. And in a way, it just reinforces why you cast them in the first place, why they were so good in the pilot that got picked up, and you don't really deviate. With James, you can go in so many different directions and you can so nail it no matter what you do that it's easier to kind of lose your way with the character, and we have gone back now, and especially in the second season, and just not so much changed but kind of reiterated the central dysfunction in the guy.
In the original, Baltar was a flat out black villain. I mean, he was irredeemable, and so the roots of the character are sort of antagonistic into everyone else, but he's sort of part of our family at the same time in this version of the show. So you're sort of always walking the line with Baltar of he's really not out for anyone but himself. But that does mean that occasionally he can be on our side too, because that serves his interests as well.
This was all very difficult conceptually because you're dealing with the fact that you've got a character alone on a planet. She's got to convey certain information about what her intent is, what her mental state is.
Just that little gag we just saw of her just taking out the stick and it turns a color and she's pissed.
Yeah.
So she doesn't have to say to herself, oh, damn, there's no oxygen on this planet.
No.
You're trying to keep the Kara talking to herself to a bare minimum just to keep it somewhat believable.
And Eick, because she's got a helmet on.
Yeah.
By the way. Now, this is great visual effects here.
Follow Galactica. We are being bounced around like beach balls down here. Visibility about...
This is going to be a hard episode to do commentary on because it's so
you
watchable.
get pulled into
it's so watchable. It's my favorite dialogue in the entire season. I have no idea what it means. Blue fight, go fight. What the hell does he say?
Vertical, now, or something.
But
he's just telling them to go up.
The other fighters.
The other fighters.
I always imagine he's talking to his R2 unit, telling the R2 unit to raise his claim.
R2?
But that's not what he's doing, clearly.
This is when I think I started to get my feet underneath me about what the story was about. Because when she is ostensibly taken by the Cylons, and then we start to cut over to the Cylons and see their reactions, you start to see that the level of manipulation that's going on is toward an end. And I kind of remember as we were talking in story terms in 4 and 5, I didn't quite understand what the point was of the exercise in 4, but by the time we got into 5, I was starting to realize that it was about getting these two to fall in love and sleep together and conceive a child.
Yeah.
That was ultimately what this was going to be about. And that as we talked about that, I started to realize that that's why would the Cylons bother to do that? Well, it means that that's really important to them, and that conception and biological reproduction was really what this whole storyline was about.
And it proves to be quite a critical issue in episode 5 of season 2.
Yeah.
This is a great callback to the slang for Cylons. Is
Richard
toaster.
Hugh Dolan, our production
Mr.
designer,
Hugh
came
Dolan.
up with that. We were in a production meeting and we were talking about he sees a reflection of the Cylons. This is, again, production driving creative choices, because we couldn't see the Cylons as much as we wanted to in this sequence.
Because of the visual effects costs.
So we were making all these sort of decisions to cheat it. Look at them through the glass block, see a reflection, see shadows, try to be creative in how you do the sequence, and we wanted them to be reflected in something, and it was something else, like a fridge or something.
I had suggested to you that we do the Hitchcock thing of he's cooking eggs, and the eggs start burning on the other side of the kitchen, and will the Cylons see the eggs burning? And that was when Richard said, or it's a toaster.
And everyone
I remember
laughed.
we were in the production meeting, Ron started shaking his head, it was like, oh shit, now that you've said that, it's got to be
a toaster. I just was so in love with that. And that's...
Well, this is actually Michael Reimer's idea. We ripped him off. Michael,
did we?
Michael said something about you should shoot them through glass and save money on visual effects. And when we got to this episode, which Michael didn't direct, I was like, okay, great.
It's really effective. It works really well, but it's driven by, we don't have a lot of money here. So, yeah, and the tension, the cutting back and forth. There was a lot of time spent in the editing room. I remember working on this and trying to get the rhythm of it right, and at what point does she walk in the room.
It's hard. It's like that story, if you watch the Jaws documentary, of when the head comes out of the porthole, Richard Dreyfuss freaks out.
Yeah.
Is it head, then freak out?
Yeah.
Is it beginning of head, freak out, end of head? And I remember, too, sitting with this stuff on the burning toast, burning Pop-Tarts? So is it
how
the
long?
smoke, then the Cylon, then the pop, or is it,
It's so
tricky.
subtle, and you can't describe it and write down the rules for it. You have to really just sit and watch the film and feel this sort of odd internal rhythm of when the cut should be.
Running a little low on O2 and I could use a lucky break.
Yeah, here she's talking to the gods and trying to pray. And you just had to be so careful with this because it becomes so hokey if you're not real
She's
careful.
narrating it for you.
Yeah.
This was a notion that I had standing in Richard's office, and we were talking about what would the thing be made of, and it was really just off the top of my head, well, what if there are guts inside of it? And that sprung into and eventually became this notion of the Cylon Raiders, which during the miniseries we were having a lot of argument with the network and the studio actually about what the Cylon Raiders looked like. And I'd said at the time to Gary Hutzel, squash a Cylon Centurion with an anvil and give it wings, and that's basically the idea that the Cylon Raiders are not craft being driven by Centurions like they were in the original Battlestar, but they are themselves Cylons. And so this evolved, as I say, into the idea that they are somehow the midway point between the humanistic Cylons and the mechanistic Cylons. And this, David and Bradley, I think, came up with, which I remember, and I'm sorry, Carl, if it was her idea, but I remember reading this on the plane, that she sees this reddish-brown ooze leaking from its eye slit.
Yeah.
And the notion that they had so owned the idea of the mechanistic-humanistic combination that the red eye, oscillating red eye, is organic and not mechanical. And I just was like getting myself a high five sitting there on the plane seat because there's no one to high five. Say, yes, this is awesome, this is great. And it's just a great small nod to the idea that those guys are really good at doing that.
They're very good at that. Yeah, they embrace those sort of notions. And David and Bradley and Carla did a lot of work on this episode before. I didn't polish this that much at all, really, in my rewrite. And David and Bradley really brought a lot of the military jargon and a lot of the procedures and a lot of how things worked in this situation to the script, and it's those kind of textures that really make the show work.
It also matched up with Sergio's approach to it really well, because I remember you saying when we were looking at the cut that you felt that this was kind of the first episode that really captured that quality of the aircraft carrier life and the jargon of it, but I do agree it had that quality.
This is the first time Eddie ever yells.
Yeah, and this is what we were talking about before, about him being...
I remember in the script it said, like, his voice is like a rifle shot across CIC and heads turn. And when he yells in this, it's like, no kidding. It's like, oh, jeez.
Yep.
We're gonna find our missing pilot. We're gonna bring her home. We leave no one behind.
Well, what was great, too, about building this Cylon Raider, the exterior Cylon Raider is all practical. Yeah. We actually built this down the soundstage.
$100,000 model.
And the only way that we were able to do it was because somehow we settled on this idea pretty early on. Yeah. We gave them a big heads up and said, okay, look, we're going to do this episode where we're going to capture a Cylon Raider and fly it away. And got them thinking about it and planning it. And a lot of television production is really driven by this idea of the more time you give your production designer and all the various members of the crew a heads up and say this is coming, they can really sort of plan things. And what happens so often in television is it's a lot of last-minute decisions, a lot of changes on the fly, a lot of sort of notions that just come out of the writers' typewriters the day before they start to shoot. And either they can't be accomplished or they cost too much to be accomplished because you're trying to squeeze everything in on a weekend and turn it around so fast that, yeah, technically we can do it, but it's going to cost you $500,000 and there's no way to get that. So the fact that David and I went in early with them and told them we didn't even have the story, we didn't have much of it worked out other than we wanted to have the Cylon Raider and gave them like weeks and weeks of prep time on it was the only thing that made it possible.
Yeah, I think a lot of television producers pride themselves on that kind of hysterical mentality of, the last-minute deliveries, script pages flying off the fax machine moments before they shoot, and everyone kind of patting themselves on the back for getting it, in the can. And the problem with that is that when you take that approach, you can't do stuff like this. Here we go with the first image of the organic tissue. This kind of thing is really, as Ron was just saying, it's really more like how you produce movies. It's all about prep, and it's all about the process of planning ahead of time. It's really pretty hideous, isn't it?
I know, it's so gross.
We reshot that insert, I think, 4 times.
Oh, I'm sure.
When we finally got it right was when I had asked the AD who directed the second unit there to literally go get slabs of prime rib. And
an interesting little beat too, where he just picks up the phone. Somebody's calling you, and it's annoying, and then it's the president. It's like,
yeah. Well, and this is an angle of the hangar deck that we just had never seen in all the time we'd spent there in the miniseries in the first 4 episodes. And Sergio was doing that a lot in this. He's finding angles on the sets that we had not seen in the show before. And now Sergio hadn't seen all the episodes, so it's interesting. As a visualist, he kind of just tends to approach scenes and these sets in a slightly different way. And he actually introduced a tendency towards a longer lens look, which is when you see those backgrounds sort of fuzz out and go into blur, and the character or the subject in the foreground becomes more suspended. They become more sort of isolated in a way. And it really kind of helps subconsciously, I think, enhance the story, enhance the theme of this particular episode, which is that these two guys are alone. They're not operating as a big unit anymore. They're kind of off adrift on their own mission. And how much of this was premeditated by Sergio or not, it was his impulse, and it really kind of introduced a different direction to go visually with the show than where we had been going, which were wider lenses and a lot more handheld. Handheld is still very much a principle of the show, but now we find ourselves, as we're talking to directors, pushing them more towards a long lens look, which I think just gives it a more cinematic quality generally.
Yeah, this all feels very much like a feature through all this.
And it is interesting that was Sergio's background, and I think it's because longer lenses, not to get too techno on y'all, but longer lenses are harder to pull focus. Scenes take longer to shoot because you're not grabbing as much of the image in the frame as you would normally, so you tend to need more coverage in order to tell the story. When you're shooting a feature, you don't worry about those things because you only need to shoot 2 pages or 3 pages a day. When you're doing a series and you got to shoot 7 pages a day, you tend to opt for more mid-range lenses because it's easier to shoot more in one shot. And I think Sergio, just to our advantage, didn't know better. And so he opted for this more feature-like look. And now, of course, we push everyone in this direction and we don't make our days. But the show looks better.
But hey. Yeah, I mean, it's all, you struggle with all this last season, and budget, and days, and deadlines, and how are we going to make it? And then, a year later, you look back, and you just don't really care about any of those things. All those battles fade away, and you're just looking at the film, and you're just really proud of what you've done.
Yeah, it's always, there's...
You never look at the show and say, God, I wish we had saved another 100,000 here. Oh, there was a way we could have gotten this one in under the wire and saved just a little bit more money.
Well, there's a saying that's now a cliche, but you'll see it in editing rooms and you'll see it in executives' offices that says, fast, cheap, good, pick 2.
Yeah.
And, you tend to, you hope that the good is always one of the 2 that you pick. We're pretty good at the budgeting of the show. We came in on budget after 13 episodes of
which is amazing.
What, by all rights, should have been a wildly over budget show with this size cast and feature directors and actors who really come from movies more than they do TV, and whose style and approach to these things tends to be more time consuming because they're perfectionists. I'm proud that we did it on budget because it's nice when you can do that, when you can look at these things and be as proud of them as you are, and be able to say to yourself, and they can't even get me on the budget. They can't even come at us and say, yeah, but you indulged, or yeah, but you went over.
Oh, sure, it looks great, but they blew the budget completely.
Yeah. Any idiot, any monkey can spend, go 100% over budget and make it look great. Well,
and it's amazing how much that carries you when you go forward as a producer. It's when you're able to point back and say, look, trust us. We brought the show in on budget. We're not irresponsible. They give you a lot more leeway.
If we had just said, screw it, we'll do whatever we want and screw the budget, well, who couldn't make things
Yeah.
And they kind of take it.
And then she walks
they
out.
kind of look at each other like, okay.
And she doesn't, it's like she doesn't get them to back down in the scene, which is nice too. She just leaves like, okay, it's up to you. You know, if you're going to be this irresponsible, I can't stop you. And she just walks out and shames them into doing it. Which is
And you know,
really nice.
whenever I say to Mary, and because she's such a professional, she won't give herself credit. Whenever I say to Mary that this was such a great scene, she'll always kind of drive right back at me. Well, you gave me the point. You gave me the point. You know, I had the point in the scene. That was, you know, I was right. And, you know, her struggle really with the subsequent episodes in the season was that we had thrown her such a curveball to make her into this person who was at once having divine visions, which were by any standard measurable and kind of provable and right, and at the same time induced by a drug, which calls into question any conclusion you might arrive at. And that was an awfully, awfully tall order to ask someone to sort of deal with in the first season of the show, which she pulled off amazingly. But I saw her longing for the simplicity and the directness of a scene like this, which was just like, boom, you know, there's no question about it. They're wrong and she's
Click
right.
and I'm out.
Yeah.